Hello and welcome back to a new episode of my true crime podcast, The True Crime Cocktail Hour. My name is Holly, I'll be your host and bartender tonight, and this is where we come together after a tough and stressful week of work to enjoy a little after-work cocktail together that I will prepare for us, just to take the edge off. And while I do that, I will also tell you the story of a true crime case. And boy, do I have a case for you today. It's got everything. We'll be talking about a mysterious murder, a long, exciting investigation. We'll be talking dark family secrets, lies, affairs, you name it. And I also want to introduce to you the lead investigator of this case, a very persistent and exceptional homicide investigator, and how he ultimately solved this case. So let's not lose any more time. I get everything ready and then we get started with case number 96, the faceless woman in the leather jacket. So it is the 6th of November, 2001, and our story begins in southern Germany, in Bavaria. The exact place is actually irrelevant to the story, you don't need to know that. Just know that we are in a rural area. So lots of farms, land, and that's pretty much it. It is still super early in the morning, around 6:30ish. And a young mother just dropped her kid off at early daycare and is now on her way back home. And home is this little farmhouse and the farm with the adjoining slaughterhouse that she runs together with her husband. So the day starts out pretty early for them as well. And her husband is already waiting at home with breakfast. Now, it takes this woman about 10 minutes to get home from daycare, provided she takes this small, narrow country road that is actually close to public traffic. But it's still super early. No one's around, so who gives a rat's ass? And so whenever that's the case, the locals use this country road as sort of like a forbidden shortcut. But at this time of day, driving on this country road can be quite scary. It is still super dark. There are no street lamps on this country road. It is foggy. And so everything this woman can see is basically whatever falls directly in front of her headlights. So this woman is driving on this country road, and she's just minding her own business, when all of a sudden, the beam of her headlights fall on something white that is lying in the middle of the road. So she jerks the steering wheel around and she misses this object, whatever it was, just by a couple of inches. She doesn't stop though, she keeps on driving. But whatever this white thing was, it won't let go of her. And she has to think about it the entire ride home. So at home, her husband is waiting for her. And when he sees his wife, he immediately realizes that she is completely beside herself and that she's shaking all over. So he asked her what was wrong. And she told him that there was this large white thing lying in the middle of this country road and that she wasn't sure whether she actually hit it or not. So her husband suggested to drive back out there together and check. So they get in the car and they drive to this very spot. But when they got out of the car, they immediately noticed this smell. A smell that they knew all too well from working at the slaughterhouse. And that was the smell of iron. So this white thing, whatever it is, still lying in the middle of the road. And the couple gets closer and they see that it's not just a large white plastic bag or an animal, but the white, lifeless body of a woman lying in a pool of blood. So just a few minutes later, this actually so gloomy little country road is lit up by the blue lights of the police cars. And everyone is already busy collecting evidence and clues. And the forensics team is there, and also the lead investigator of this case. So let me introduce to you This is homicide investigator Andreas Herzog. At the time of this story, he is 45 years old, and he's been with the homicide unit for a little bit over 2 years now. And considering the scene of the crime and how this body was found, we're talking homicide. So let's take a look at the autopsy report. What do we know and how did this person die? So the victim was found lying face down on the street and her arms were twisted in a very weird fashion. She looked like as if she had been literally just thrown away. The coroner found dirt and a lot of tire tread marks on her back. Also, her body showed numerous bruises and her entire body showed signs of blunt force trauma. So the coroner concluded that this victim had been run over by a car at least twice, but she was already dead after the first run over. But that's not all. He also found marks of strangulation and fingernail scratches around the victim's neck. And he also found injuries in her genital and anal area. Time of death between 0:50 and 1:50 in the morning. So it is now obvious that lead investigator Andreas Herzog is not just dealing with another random homicide case, but with a case of overkill. And as you know, that can be a clue to the victim and her killer knowing each other. And overall, Andreas Herzog is quite confident that he can solve this case quickly. And he doesn't really tell anybody, but he gives himself 7 weeks, a deadline of 7 weeks to solve this case, which is admirable and maybe even realistic. There's just one big problem with it all. The thing is, this woman doesn't have a face anymore. Whoever had run this woman over did one hell of a job, because they had run over her head and they had run over her face. And so whatever skin was left of her face and of her head was just hanging on one side of her skull. And that was it. The rest of it was basically gone. And I don't need to tell you that without a face, it's very, very difficult to identify this woman. And the team and the investigators around Andreas Herzog, they have very little to begin with. But there's a couple of things they can tell about the victim. So for starters, the autopsy had revealed that this woman had at least once carried out a child. They also found a couple of clothing items right next to the victim. For example, a pair of 18-karat gold yellow earrings that are quite valuable. So it's fair to say that maybe this woman isn't richy rich, but she's got some money. And lucky to investigators, they were also able to secure a foreign DNA at the crime scene. But that is pretty much it. That's all they can say at this point. So after the autopsy is done, Herzog and his team have a dentist look at the victim's teeth and her jaw to at least maybe roughly narrow down her age. So this dentist takes a look at the woman's teeth, and she finally comes to the result that this woman might be between 25 and 30 years old. However, the coroner who performed the autopsy, he was quite surprised about this, because after looking at the bones and everything, he thought that this woman must be a lot older. So that's helpful, thank you very much. Despite having so little information, Herzog and his team decide to go public with the little information they have, but no new leads come in. No one in Bavaria can help the investigators. Also, the victim's DNA is nowhere to be found in any criminal database, as is the foreign DNA. No results. Hundreds of police officers spent hours digging through all the missing person files in hopes of finding a woman that fit that description, what they had at this point, because she had carried out a child. Somebody must have reported her missing. The results are as disappointing as you are to your family. Actually, they got nothing. So in cases like that, the last resort is a TV show that is very popular in Germany, and it's called Aktenzeichen XY ungelöst, Case File XY unsolved, and it's quite the German equivalent of America's Most Wanted. So what happens is an investigator appears on this show, he talks to the host of the show and tells him about his recent case. And that's how they reach the entire German audience. The thing is, the lead investigator would really love to be able to present a face there, because that might increase his chances of getting the help he needs. But I mean, how is he supposed to do that? Well, this is when the German criminal state police gets involved, and they offered Herzog help with facial reconstruction, something that Herzog gladly accepted. But baby girl, whoever was in charge of face reconstruction at the German criminal state police in the year 2002 just went and digitally repainted over all the reddish areas of the face, and there were a lot, and he just painted it white. And the result was actually just as frightening as the original, and was not even close to anything any person should ever be subjected to. So they had to retouch the face again and then again and again until it was halfway presentable. But they actually ended up showing this picture on this TV show. But again, no clues whatsoever. But there's a silver lining after all. Because by that point, investigators had found out that the golden earrings found at the crime scene were made in a factory in North Italy. And just one day after the body was found, a woman contacted police, and she told them that she was out walking her dog when her dog all of a sudden sniffed out a blood-stained plastic bag. And this bag that had the words Ochan, I think, I don't know how to say it, but that's how it's written. That was on the bag, and the bag contained several blood-stained pieces of women's clothing. So investigators took a look at the clothes in this bag, and they were quite certain that they belonged to the victim. For example, they found a pair of shoes and a scarf. Both of these items were also made in Italy. They also found a purple bra that matched the color of the lady slip that was lying right next to the victim. And they found a black leather jacket. And this leather jacket should become very, very important. Investigators found out that this leather jacket was also made in Italy by a brand called La Matta. And inside of this leather jacket, investigators found a label that had the words, "You got to move," written on it. So there is an ounce of hope. So all the leads they have at this point point towards Italy. So maybe this woman's got nothing to do with Germany, and she was just found here. So Herzog thinks to himself, well, maybe appearing on that German TV show wasn't right because it's simply not my audience. So he decides to appear on another TV show, the Italian equivalent of America's Most Wanted. And that show is called Chi l'ha visto. But this show turns out to be an absolute disaster. So you have to imagine, like, Herzog shows up at this TV show, and before the show goes live, he's still talking backstage to the production team and the host of the show. And this was already a massive, big red flag, because Herzog sensed immediately what the production team and the host of the TV show really wanted. Brutality, sensation, blood, all the things that sell a good story. So even though Herzog was able to present his findings and the results of the investigation so far in a calm and factual manner, it was hard for him to get through this show. And actually, like right before they would go live, he would later say that the host of this show came up to him and she was like, "Hey, Mr. Herzog, it would be really, really beneficial if you would maybe call the killer a killer monster. Maybe you should speak of a killer monster. That will sell it." He also noticed later, when watching the show, that the people working at this TV show very, freely translated whatever he was saying into Italian. So he probably said something along the line of, "I would really love to solve this case." And they translated it to, "I will not sleep anymore and I will not rest until I found that perpetrator." And for what? For nothing. No one who watched that TV show was able to give any helpful information. So this investigation has been going on for exactly 7 weeks now, and they have nothing. And the press is also up their asses. It is maddening. So I guess it's just out of a gut feeling that Herzog and his team again try to take a look at the victim's teeth in order to pinpoint down her age. So there is a procedure with which you can examine how much a certain acid level changed in the dentin over the course of a lifespan. So bottom line, the older a person is, the higher this acid level. And so they do this procedure, and it turns out that the coroner was right. This woman is much older. She is actually between 43 and 46 years old. So all this digging through missing person files, for nothing. It was all for nothing. So that is a setback. And again, they go through all the missing person files, this time looking in the right age span, trying to find this woman. And again, nothing. And now, Andreas Herzog has had enough. He can't take it anymore. So eventually, they decided to contact a renowned anthropologist in Germany specialized in facial reconstruction, and she agreed to take on this case. So to be able to reconstruct a face, you first have to separate the head from the body and then remove all the facial tissue until you only have the skull. So the tissue-free skull of the victim is the base. And then there's this database that has countless facial parts saved in it. And so they rebuild this face. And obviously, like a lot of experience-based rules apply. For example, you can try this at home, actually. It's quite interesting. The length of your ear corresponds with the distance between your nasal root and your nasal base. And so investigators end up having a face to present to the public. And again, no leads come in. So he's thinking to himself, okay, you know what? I have to find another way to look at this. I have to find a new perspective. I have to keep looking someplace else. And since he knows that a lot of the woman's clothing came from Italy, he thinks to himself, well, this woman is probably Italian, or at least lives in Italy. So let's talk about this leather jacket again for a second. It was manufactured in Italy by a company, a leather goods company called La Mata, with the sentence, "You got to move," written on the inside of the jacket. And this is when it gets interesting. Andreas Herzog finds out that this leather jacket was only produced in a very limited run. Only 14 jackets were made. So Andreas Herzog really wants to talk to this leather goods company who made these jackets. But he has to get a search warrant for that. And in order to get a search warrant, he had to work together with the Italian authorities. Now, I was also wondering, why does he need a search warrant? Why doesn't he just go over there and ask? Well, baby girl, he did try that. He did try that. He showed up at this leather goods company and told the owner of the company what his visit was all about. And he asked her if he could maybe look around the company. But this woman politely but firmly declined, saying that this company doesn't want to have anything to do with a murder. That would be very bad reputation. So he had to get a search warrant. So Herzog at first thinks of working together with the Carabinieri. But then an Austrian colleague of his, who is very familiar with working with the Italian authorities, gives him some great advice. And he was like, hey, listen, if you want any Italian business to cooperate with you, forget the Carabinieri. Get the tax and fraud department involved. And even though it takes another freaking year until all warrants are approved, eventually, finally, the search can begin. And the owner of this leather goods company, she's quite surprised to see Andreas Herzog again. But then she sees that he's got the tax and fraud department with him. And all of a sudden, she's super nice. Be my guest. Walk in. Red carpet. She cooperated immediately and handed out all that she had about these leather jackets. So Herzog found out that these 14 leather jackets were all sold. Some were sold in the United States of America, some were sold in Italy, one in Japan, and one even in Germany. But that was it again. But then something unexpected happens. A couple of days later, An employee of this leather goods company watched the TV show Quilla Vista again, in which Herzog appeared and talked about this case. And she noticed something about the leather jacket of the victim. The leather jacket of the victim had the full sentence, "You got to move," on the label. But they only used the full sentence in 9 out of those 14 jackets. The other 5 only had the word "move," and that was it. But it gets even better. All of these 9 jackets with the full sentence in them were delivered to the same fashion dealer in Italy, namely an outlet store in Mestre near Venice. So Andreas Herzog and his team, they drive out to this outlet store and they talk to the owner. And they find out that all 9 jackets were sold. 7 of these jackets were paid for in cash. 2 were paid by credit card. So one of these 2 jackets was bought by a man, and the other was bought by a woman on the 2nd of October, 1999. So Herzog takes the credit card information and compares it to the personal information of the person owning this credit card. This woman, who bought the leather jacket in 1999, was 43 years old at the time. And she's got a name. Her name is Elizabeth Landsman. Finally, the investigation is making progress. And so Herzog, with a whole new bunch of motivation, tried to find out more about Elizabeth Landsman. And they find out that she's married to a 58-year-old ship engineer called Alessandro Salomi, and that they really do have a daughter together called Eleonora. And they find out that Alessandro Salomi and his daughter are living together. So they drive out to the address. Of course, they want to talk to Alessandro Salomi, but they also want to talk to the daughter, Eleonora, and also ask her for a DNA sample so they can really officially identify the victim as Elizabeth Landsman. So they wait in front of this apartment, and they wait. And they wait for days, and no one shows up. But in the meantime, they talk to a couple of neighbors, and were quite surprised to hear that Alessandro Salomi was referring to himself as a widower, even though he never reported his wife missing. And there's another question. Investigators had absolutely no idea where Elizabeth's cell phone is, but they were able to figure out her phone number. So Herzog was now sitting there with the Italian authorities debating over whether they should call this number or not. And Herzog wanted to wait, at least until they figured out what to actually say in case someone should pick up. But the investigator, the Italian investigator he had to work with, disagreed. And he was like, why wait? And so he called this number, and someone picked up the phone. And it was the voice of a woman. So the Italian investigator asked if this was Elizabeth Landsman speaking. And this woman, and we still don't know, by the way, who she is. They were never able to figure that out. But this woman just said, no. And then the Italian investigator asked, well, this is her number now, is it? And this woman just replied that she was given this phone as a birthday present by a friend of hers. And she asked the investigators what they wanted. You know, what was all this about? Because she was getting suspicious. And so, just out of nowhere, the Italian investigator said, oh, it's just a tax thing. This is about a tax thing. And this woman just hangs up. But all of a sudden, just a few minutes later, the Italian investigator gets a phone call back from Elizabeth's number. And he answers the phone, but this time there's a man on the other end of the line who introduces himself as Paolo Russo. And the first thing he asked is, what do you want from Elizabeth Landsman? And again, the Italian investigator says it's about a tax thing. And this is when Paolo Russo just willy-nilly said, I just know that she disappeared after having this huge argument with her husband, Alessandro. And the Italian investigator asked him, well, how do you know Elizabeth Landsman? And Paolo Russo said that he was an architect by profession and that he did some work for Elizabeth Landsman. And that he also knew her daughter, Eleonora. So the husband, a gun. Okay. Wherever he may be. Not at his apartment, apparently, so investigators drive out to his workplace. But he's not there either. So his colleagues just tell investigators that he's out because he's having appointments all day. But they also promise the investigators to let him know about the investigator's visit and that he should call them back. And to everyone's surprise, a couple of hours later, Alessandro Salome actually does call them. And it is super weird. Something is up with this man, okay? So investigators are like, hey, we want to talk to you about the leather jacket, and we also need to talk to your daughter. And Alessandro Salome has no further questions. Not what's this leather jacket is about. Nothing. That's obviously enough information for him. We need to talk to you about the leather jacket. Okay. And investigators are quite shocked to see that Alessandro Salome is quite busy preventing the investigators from talking to his daughter, saying all over again that she's studying in Pescara and that she has mental health problems and that he just doesn't like to see investigators speaking with his daughter. So instead, he's like, you know what, you can talk to me. You don't need to talk to my daughter, you can talk to me. I'm in city so-and-so and you can come visit me and talk to me. So to the lead investigator, this whole thing is super strange. Why would he not want them to talk to his daughter? This is a grown-ass woman. She's 24 years old. She can decide for herself. But it gets weirder. When they drive out to the city where Alessandro is currently staying, you have to imagine this scene, okay? Andreas Herzog and this Italian investigator are sitting across from Alessandro Salome. And the investigators eventually decide to come clean and tell Alessandro what their visit is actually about. So they eventually say, sir, we found the naked body of a woman in southern Germany, and we also found a leather jacket that we know belonged to your wife. So we have reasons to assume that the body we found is that of your wife, Elizabeth. And the first thing Alessandro Salome says is, murder? This is super exciting. And Herzog and his investigator colleague, they just look at each other because no one has ever said anything about murder. Are you all right, sir? So there's nothing but silence for a second. And then Alessandro Salome all of a sudden starts crying. And he takes a look at the leather jacket. He also asks for a picture of the dead woman and he identifies her as his wife. And so he's crying and sobbing, and one of the investigators hands him over a handkerchief. And he uses that, and then they secretly take it away again, because now they have his DNA. Jackpot, baby. So considering this new development, they again ask Alessandro whether they could talk to his daughter. And again, this shithead refuses. And he says, I want to be the one to tell her about her mother's death, about her mother's murder. So give me just 5 days to take care of that, and then you can come and talk to her. 5 days, that's all I need. Which I was like, that's quite a long time. 48 hours, yes, be my guest. But 5 days? And Herzog first speaks to his colleague and he's like, well, that's way too long. Like, we need to talk to her right now. Like, what's going on here? But for some reason, the Italian investigator is like, no. Like, we have to respect his wishes. So they agree. Alessandro Salome now has 5 days to talk to his daughter, and then they can talk to her. And Andreas Herzog is sitting there and he's thinking he is in a fucking madhouse. Since when do suspects tell us how we do our work? But I mean, they are in Italy and the suspect is Italian and he's not in charge here, and so he just has to do whatever the Italian investigators decide to do. But that decision would claim another life. So 4 days go by. Just one more day and Herzog and his team can finally drive up to Pescara and talk to this daughter, Eleonora. So it's 6 a.m. in the morning when all of a sudden Alessandro Salome calls up Andreas Herzog. And Alessandro Salome is in full-blown panic mode. And he tells the investigator that he just received a phone call from his daughter, Eleonora. And she just said, I love you. So he tried to call her again. She wouldn't pick up the phone. Instead, he got a text message from her saying, take care of the dog. I hope you can forgive me. Adieu. And so now Alessandro Salome is super worried that his daughter might do something to herself. Alessandro Salome actually blames Herzog and his team for whatever his daughter is up to now, because he thinks that they already talked to her behind his back. So he wants to know, hey, did you talk to my daughter after all? Does she know what's going on that you are investigating? And Herzog obviously says, no, we respected your wishes. She doesn't know anything. We didn't talk to her. And so they ask in return, Alessandro, did you maybe talk to anybody or to Eleonora about the investigation that we want to talk to her? And Alessandro Salome says, I only talked to one person. I talked to my daughter's fiancé because I wanted him to be by her side when he tells her the news about the murder of her mother. Herzog is like, okay, do you have a name? Like, who is this fiancé? And Alessandro Salome says, his name is Paolo Russo. Hold on a second. That rings a bell. The architect, who for some reason could not be bothered to mention at the phone that he is actually the fiancé of Eleonora Salome, the daughter of the deceased. So now Herzog and his team have to act super quickly. They have to find Eleonora before she could possibly harm herself or others. So they think, well, we now know who the fiancé is, so maybe he knows where she's at. So they call him at home, and to their surprise, a woman answers the phone. And she says that her husband, Paolo Russo, is not at home. She doesn't know where he is. This poor woman had no idea. Unfortunately, though, it is already too late. What Andreas Herzog does not know is that someone had just made an emergency call in Italy. Several drivers driving on a country road in Italy had spotted a young man running up and down this country road in full-blown panic mode, only wearing a shirt, a pair of underpants, and shoes. So eventually one of these drivers stopped and asked the man if he needed help. And this man said, yes, please call the carabinieri. My fiancée just shot herself in the head in the car right next to me. And investigators end up finding his fiancée, Eleonora Salome, slumped in the passenger seat with a massive gunshot wound to her head. Right next to her hand was a pistol, but also a suicide note. And in that note, to everyone's surprise, Eleonora Salome confessed to the murder of her mother. But what could be her motive? Turns out that Elizabeth Landman's father was a real big shot in the drug business in the Netherlands. And one day when he was killed on duty, he left his daughter and granddaughter $240,000 that he had stashed in a secret account in Switzerland. So one day, Elizabeth traveled to Switzerland to get the $240,000. But on her way back to Italy, she was caught by custom officials and she had to pay a 60% penalty for not declaring the assets. So now her daughter Eleonora was super pissed because she felt she was still entitled to half of the $240,000. But now there was only 40% left. And she expected her mother to pay the difference out of her own pocket because it was her mistake. But Elizabeth did not want to do that. So investigators asked Paolo Russo about this whole freaking story, and he actually confirmed this. Mother and daughter had been fighting over money. But Paolo Russo also said that Eleonora had a second motive to hurt her mother, and that motive was jealousy. Check this out. Paolo Russo over here is not only cheating on his wife with his fiancée Eleonora, but also with Eleonora's mother, Elizabeth Landsman. Yes, he was sleeping with the mother and the daughter and then went home to his wife. And Paolo Russo thought that Eleonora maybe had found out about the affair he was having with her mother and couldn't handle it. Paolo even said that he was present during Elizabeth's murder. So he said that he was driving in a car with Eleonora and her mother Elizabeth, and Eleonora was sitting in the back seat where she eventually fell asleep. So Paolo and Elizabeth took this chance, stopped the car, and enjoyed themselves and each other somewhere in the woods. But okay. And so eventually they got back into the car. And this is when suddenly an argument broke out between Eleonora and her mother. And it got so bad that Paolo allegedly at some point had to stop the car. But before he could even get out of the car, Eleonora and Elizabeth were already out the car, fighting with each other. And he said that he saw Eleonora attacking her own mother with a glass bottle. So eventually Elizabeth was lying there with a smashed in skull. And this is when Eleonora told Paolo to undress Elizabeth, get rid of the clothes, and then Eleonora went behind the wheel and ran over her mother twice. That's Paolo's story. And now that she figured that investigators were onto her and that they wanted to talk to her and, what's more, take her DNA sample, she just knew, she had this feeling that she will be revealed as the murderer once they compare the foreign DNA of the scene of the crime to her own DNA. And according to Paolo, this is allegedly why she shot herself in the car. So he told investigators that he just witnessed his fiancée shooting herself in the head. And the first thing he does is, oh, look, my clothes are full of blood. Let me undress and then get help, which doesn't make sense at all. I mean, great story. He thinks he's such a smarty pants. He's just a dumbass. Listen, the bloody clothes that he took off, allegedly, were nowhere to be found. Nowhere. No bloody clothes, no. The suicide note turned out as fake. The DNA they found on Elizabeth and at the scene of the crime turned out to be his and not Eleonora's. Fact is that there were no clues or evidence that a third person was even present when Elizabeth was murdered. And investigators found out that Paolo Russo, after Elizabeth's murder, had deposited $50,000 into various bank accounts. Where the rest of the money is, no clue. Bottom line, Paolo Russo was convicted of the crime and he was charged with the murder of Elizabeth Landsman and her daughter, Eleonora Salumi, and he was ultimately sentenced to 2 life terms. The motive for Elizabeth's murder was probably greed. Why Eleonora had to die, that could not be clarified to this day. It is assumed that she probably found out. Good news is, Paolo Russo is still rotting away in prison somewhere in southern Italy. A few last words about the investigator of today's story, Andreas Herzog. It took him longer than 7 weeks. It actually took him 6 years to solve this case, but it was one of the biggest cases of his career. He retired in 2016 and he sadly passed away in 2022, surprisingly, at the age of 66. But the faceless woman in the leather jacket is not faceless anymore. She has a face and a name, and her murderer is behind bars to this day. So that was it. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you liked this video, if you enjoyed it, give this video a thumbs up or leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you don't have any plans, Friday in 2 weeks, I hope we will see each other again for another cocktail and, of course, another mysterious true crime case. And I'm so looking forward to next time, because next time we'll be heading to a country we have never been before on this channel. We'll be talking about a very, very mysterious murder in a luxury hotel. So until then, have a lovely weekend. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Kiss. Mwah. And I'll see you then.